Hey y'all, I have a few quick announcements before we start today's show. First, this is the season finale of Season 3, and I wanted to give you the date for our return in Season 4. That will be on July 29th. Now, that's a little bit longer of a break than we've had before, and the reason for that is that Anna and I are expecting our first child in early July. And so with that in mind, Phil and I wanted to extend that break a little bit because I know that my schedule will be a little chaotic in the weeks and months that follow the arrival of our child. And our goal for the podcast is to still ensure that our episodes release on a bi-weekly basis. And this will give us a little bit more time to make sure that that still happens. In the meantime, between Season 3 and 4, we do plan on releasing a few hiatus episodes in the main feed still. Now, if you are still itching for more Narnia, this is just a reminder that you can also head over to Patreon and listen to the Dancing Lawn podcast, where we recently covered the 1979 cartoon adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the BBC's Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Also, we have an incredible guest awaiting you in today's season finale. Dr. Crystal Hurd joins us and brings years of expertise and research to the show. Y'all are in for a real treat. I do just want to give a heads up that my audio quality is a little lower than what you're probably used to, and that's just us trying to navigate what recording remotely looks like because of the current crisis that we're living in. But thankfully, Crystal and Phil, they still sound wonderful. And finally, as I did mention, with the current health crisis that we are in, Phil and I hope and pray that all y'all are doing all right and staying safe. And then we hope that in these difficult times, you can find respite and solace in the wonderful world of Narnia that Lewis has created. And so until next season, take care. Well, hello, and welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 16 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Very End of the World.
A really special chapter, and we have a special guest.
We do. Today we are joined by Dr. Crystal Hurd. She has written extensively on C.S. Lewis, but I don't need to tell people more about that. I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more.
Hi, this is Crystal. How are you guys?
We're doing great. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to this for a long time. We got to meet you back in November at the C.S. Lewis Symposium. Been talking about getting you on the show, and we're glad to have you here in a really special chapter. And I think this is a pretty special chapter to you as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. This I know there's mixed reviews about the movie, the film, but this scene is one of my favorite film scenes of all movies I've ever watched.
Wow.
Yeah, one of my favorites.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to get to it because it's really special.
Yeah, I'm excited to see that too now.
That's true. You finished the book, Phil, so you can finally watch the movie. And we'll talk more about that because we do have some hiatus episodes coming up. We will talk about the movie. But this is exciting, yeah. Yep. Before we jump into the chapter, though, we wanted to ask you a couple of questions, Crystal. Some questions that we ask all of our guests, and then a couple that are specifically tailored to you. So first, can you just tell us what your relationship is with these books, the Chronicles of Narnia?
Sure. Honestly, I did not read the Chronicles of Narnia as a child. I didn't read them till I was 30. And I was doing research on my dissertation. My doctoral dissertation research concerned C.S. Lewis as a transformational leader and how he crafted transformational characters. So basically, I married C.S. Lewis with leadership theory, which was it was exhausting, but a very fun research to do. And I ended up doing a lot of interviews and just reading and doing deep dives into a whole lot of Lewis's bibliography. So when I actually approached it more from a critical perspective because I was looking for specific aspects of leadership in it, but honestly, it just swallowed me up, and I loved it. And one interesting side note was that my mom in 2011, when I was doing the research, my mom was recovering from breast cancer, and she's been cancer-free now for 8 years. Woo! So,
Oh, good.
yeah, and you can imagine, here I am reading The Magician's Nephew, and my mom had been dealing with a lot of complications from her surgery and everything, and so I felt so much like Diggory. Like, I wanted to go get that magic apple. I wanted to get that magic fruit and bring it back to my mom and heal her. Which, now again in retrospect, she's healed, and I think that's amazing, and God's good. But it was for me, it was an emotional read because of just my personal connection with the text. So I came at it from a critical perspective, but I became a fan immediately after that. I actually loved Lewis for his apologetics works. That's where I discovered him, was through Mere Christianity. But, it's sort of like opening a door to a huge room where all of these other, I guess, opening a wardrobe, and seeing this whole other world and this whole other world view through Lewis. So, and through Lewis, I met, all these other great writers like Tolkien and Chesterton and MacDonald. So there were all these other great writers I had no idea that were writing the stuff I wanted to read. So Narnia is just one great piece in a large bibliography of Lewis that I just love and adore. And I loved rereading them. Rereading them is better each time.
That's so true. We when we do the preparation for this show, we read each chapter several times, and it's not quite the same as reading it all the way through and then reading it all the way through again. But it's neat that these stories really appealed to me as a child, and now they're appealing to me as a young adult, and then I imagine it will just continue as I continue to read them through the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great answer. It's really cool we just had Justin, who's also a friend of yours, on the show pretty recently, and he also encountered them a little, not as a child. And so it's really great to hear from people because I think so many of us have encountered them while we were young or did encounter them while we were young, to hear what the relationship to these books is if you're someone who reads them as an adult. So that's really cool. And you did mention one earlier. You talked a little bit about The Magician's Nephew. Do you have a favorite Narnia Chronicle?
Oh, wow. I think my absolute favorite is The Doorway, is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But one of my close seconds is The Horse and His Boy. I love that book. And the first time I read through them, I was like, what is this? Because it's all of our main characters are peripheral characters in that book. They're mentioned and referenced, and they have a little bit of dialogue, but not much. But I've learned to love Erebus and Bree, and there's so many great characters in that. I mean, and I think just from a literary perspective, sometimes when you shift characters, you lose part of your audience because those are the characters people love and relate to. But Lewis just did this great job with creating additional characters within this wider world that are just as interesting and just as intriguing.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's really something to look forward to.
I won't spoil it for you.
Yeah.
I can hear you holding back, and I appreciate it.
Yes.
That's a great answer, Crystal. And we have a couple more questions for you that pertain to some of the work you've done on Lewis. So if listeners aren't familiar with your work, can you just tell us a little bit about your work? Oh, and you can talk about your dissertation as well, too.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I guess my first real foray into the research was my doctoral research on Lewis's transformational leader. Currently, I'm actually modifying that into a book to put on the market. So working on that right now, actually, while we're in quarantine.
Yeah.
But it'll be modified and sort of talk about qualities that we all, as leaders, and part of the body of Christ is that we're all leaders in our own way. And there are aspects of our lives where we're all leaders, and we're all doing and influencing and inspiring. So sort of understanding what our place is in the wider body of Christ, and embracing what God has given us and using those talents to lead in whatever realm we operate in. So I did that in 2012, and then I started a blog right after I graduated, which is crystalhurd.com. I haven't written on there in a while because I have been shifting focus on some of the books I've been doing and the articles and stuff. And I do tons of research before I do anything. I'm incredibly meticulous. As I speak, I'm surrounded by notebooks and books and pens and highlighters. I do a lot of research before I put anything out there. So one of the things that that the research allowed me to do was sort of dive into other works that Lewis did. And so an interesting story, when I was doing my dissertation defense, a person who was in the room, I quoted Membership, which talks about hierarchies, social hierarchies, right? So teacher over student, man over wife, et cetera, et cetera. And so the man made he was just an observer, but he made the comment that Lewis sounds like a misogynist to me. And of course I was really taken aback, and A, he wasn't even supposed to say anything, but B, but honestly, if I ever see that man, I'm buying him a fruit basket, because that comment spurned more research for me. You know, if this is how people on the outside think, you know, on the outside of this Lewis circle are thinking about Lewis, then maybe it's time that I, you know, apply a critical lens and go in and read and think about what Lewis did with women. So I did in 2013, I did a 12-part series on Lewis and women on my website. And that actually ended up being turned, well, a friend of mine, Carolyn Curtis, was putting together a book on Lewis and women because there's such scattered opinions about Lewis and females. And she had seen my blog, and so she invited me to do chapter 1 on Flora Lewis, which is Lewis's mother, who's amazing individual. And so I went to the Wade in 2014 to do research for that. The Wade is an amazing place. If you ever get an opportunity to go there, please go. So then I started reading up on Lewis's parents, and I thought, yeah, this family is really intriguing. Like they're full of personality and spunk and intellect and wit, and I can see how they could have a son like C.S. Lewis. So right after, right before the book came out, I think the Women in Lewis book came out in 2015. In 2014, I released a devotional called 30 Days of C.S. Lewis, which is, it's basically for women, but it's using some of C.S. Lewis's wisdom to talk about our daily lives and living as Christ wants us to, and how to stay inspired, you know, in this journey called life, because it's a tough journey, you know, for a lot of us. And so I wrote that and published that in 2014. And then in 2015, I started an MFA in creative writing because I'm crazy, I guess. And so that I had to sort of back away for a little while. But I did do a few articles on Lewis's parents. I did an article for Seven called Bade, which is about C.S. Lewis's father. So over the last several years, I've started doing work on the Lewis family. So now I'm working currently on a manuscript on Lewis's family, including the mother and father, Albert and Flora. Well, it should go this way, right? It should go Flora and Albert. Sorry. So I'm working with Flora and Albert and sort of doing a family investigation to see how Lewis was brought up and how those things inspired his artistry. So it's been so much fun. So I'm working on both of those books right now and doing some related work on Lewis's family. I've got an article due to a Romanian journal at the end of this year on the Lewis family, and I'm also working with Charlie Starr, another Lewis scholar, on releasing some previously unpublished Lewis papers out of the Lanier Library, which is in Houston, Texas.
Wow. That is quite a full schedule ahead of you.
There's a lot of good stuff coming out. That's great.
Yeah. The family book I've been working on, you know, daily, and it's so much fun. I have a lot of work from the Wade Center, old letters between family members. They were just so witty. It's interesting because we feel like, through the past, we always felt like everybody was very serious. All of our heroes were, always very serious. But reading the letters, it's almost like being transported back into time, and and it made me realize that human suffering and human experience, it has not changed or altered over the decades and the centuries. We're all still imperfect beings, kind of floating around and adrift in our questions and uncertainties, but God is the constant. So it's really interesting. It's a lot of fun. I like to bore people talking about it.
I don't think you're boring our listeners at all. And in fact, I know many of them are probably now going to be anxious for the work that you're doing right now, which obviously they can't read at this moment. But I will have links to your website and to the blogs in case listeners want to dive into that right now. So, and I think you did that whole series there on the blog, like you said, right, on women in Lewis, correct?
Yes. And
so, yeah, I'll link that for listeners because I've read through quite a few of them, and they are absolutely fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I did want to mention Sehnsucht. I serve as review editor for Sehnsucht, the C.S. Lewis Journal, and it is one of the pleasures of my life. It's so much fun to work with scholars and writers and fans, and look at the new scholarship that's coming out, and read and meditate, and it's a fun job. And we just recently released our 2019 volume, and one of those featured articles was a fragment, a fallen angel fragment that Charlie Starr and Brenton Dickinson worked on, that was previously unpublished, which was something that connected. Brenton had done some work earlier where he connected the Screwtape Letters to the Space Trilogy. So some interesting stuff. So we actually just published that. That's as a previously unpublished piece. And if you're interested in obtaining a copy of Sehnsucht, you can order those through Whiff and Stock.
Well, Crystal, let me ask you one more thing about the work that you've done, which is, as listeners are hearing, is an incredible amount of academic work on Lewis. And just to ask a broader question, what is it about Lewis for you that has made him become such a large part of your academic life and research? What is so attractive about him, his life, his work, his family, that keeps you coming back to him?
That's a great question. For me, I think my initial attraction to Lewis was that he was a Christian who was a critical thinker and a critical reader. In 2001, I'm showing my age here, but in 2001, I graduated with my English Lit degree from the University of Tennessee. And I was in a, traditional university setting where, not many people talked about faith. And if they did, it was sort of with a sneer. There was a lot of, I wouldn't say hostility, but there was just a lot of discouragement about being a Christian in the university setting. So there wasn't a whole lot of things other than we're talking about more of our, I guess, Christian writing, if you would consider, Dante's Divine Comedy and Pilgrim's Progress and a few other things that we studied critically through classes. But I wanted something contemporary. I'd grown up in a Free Will Baptist church, and I'm now Lutheran, but there was not a whole lot of critical literature to read. It was a whole lot of sermonettes, things of that nature. And so I wanted something that would provide me with the same depth, but from a Christian worldview. And someone mentioned to me, well, why don't you try C.S. Lewis? I bet he would be a good fit for you. And I honestly don't remember who it was, but I wish I could. I would send them a Amazon gift card or something. I mean, really, it was life changing. They said, well, you should read Mere Christianity. And I remember reading Mere Christianity. I got to I was underlining everything in the book. Like I was underlining and highlighting everything. And I got about 3 chapters in, and I was absolutely sold on him. So after that, I was like, wow, so this does exist. There is a market for intellectual Christians, quote unquote, who really want to blend the intellect with the heart. And so that was sort of the integration, really, of those things. And then, of course, with Lewis, you can also add in imagination. So it's really a blend of imagination, intellect, and heart. And I just thought that was, to me, the perfect kind of literature. So as I read him, and he's, his bibliography is incredibly wide. I mean, if you count everything, it was, to me, that's what keeps me coming back to him is that same attraction to that blend, to that integration, that personally for me as a Christian is necessary for me in my spiritual walk in my life is to have to interrogate those questions, of faith, because we all have questions, but at the same time to not forfeit our faith while we interrogate those hard questions. So that's what I loved about Lewis, was that he wasn't scared to ask those questions, but he was steadfast in his belief.
Yeah,
that's such a great answer, and I think you're hitting on this point that I see just from doing this podcast, which is we have a very diverse listenership. I don't know if that's a word, but you're the English major. Is that correct? Can I say listenership?
Let me Google it. No, I'm just kidding.
No. But we do, especially when it comes to religion and spirituality, we have listeners who are from evangelical backgrounds or Catholic, mainline. We have non-religious listeners, and it's been, we have a lot of emails that people will share, like, I don't necessarily come from maybe the same background that you do. I actually really appreciate it when our listeners who are not religious even say, like, we've had a couple that say they even enjoy hearing us talk about some of the more religious elements of the books. And there's this thing that happens with Lewis where I think we all find this common ground where maybe for some of us, like you're mentioning, Crystal, there's this kind of desire for scholarship or for just deeper academic and intellectual dives into Christian works from like Lewis does, because he's an academic, from this academic perspective that maybe we don't find other places. And then I don't want to speak for people who aren't religious, but what I hear though from some of them is that there's still this approach to religion, obviously Christianity in particular, that has this imaginative and almost mystical element to it that maybe for people who aren't religious, they don't think about as much. You kind of see maybe religion being a very strict kind of dogmatic thing, and yet Lewis is opening up this mystical, imaginative world that maybe didn't seem like it was there before. And so we all find this common ground in Lewis. We all come from so many different angles, and we saw that even when we were all together at the symposium. I mean, there was all kinds of different religious backgrounds there. Even within, Christianity can be so diverse when it comes to denominations and all these other things. And we would talk to people who are Catholic and Protestant, and I don't think we talked to anybody who was Orthodox. So if we do have any Orthodox listeners, I'd love to know. I think that's maybe one of the only boxes we haven't checked yet. But it's just really cool to hear how so many of us find this attraction to Lewis, even with different diverse backgrounds.
It's interesting that you mentioned that a lot of people define faith as a set of regulations, because if you ever I don't know if you've read Smoke on the Mountain, which is Joy Davidman's book on the Ten Commandments, but Lewis wrote the foreword or the introduction for that book, and the whole introduction to that book is discussing how obedience leads to freedom, right? How obedience to the scripture actually leads to joy, right? And liberty, and it's amazing, because here's a book about, here are the 10 rules you need to live your life by, and yet Lewis looks at it as if, here are all these things that you can partake in if you choose to follow Christ, and here are these things that if you follow these rules, your life will be abundant and full, and you will avoid a lot of obstacles in your life by doing that. So it's such a great, I think he uses the metaphor a couple times where in an orchestra, the music only sounds wonderful when all of the musicians are playing according to the sheet music, right? And so it's this great metaphor of like, if we all work together and we all do, good, and we all practice good, then the world itself will transform.
Wow.
That's great. Yeah. I need to pick that up then. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. Oh, Joy Davidman was, I really do believe she was an intellectual equal of C.S. Lewis. Great. I'm a huge fan of Joy Davidman. I really am. She has quite a story. And I don't know if you've mentioned, you've talked about Patty Callahan's book, which it's historical fiction, but Becoming Mrs. Lewis, I think, is a great fictional depiction of Joy Davidman and her and Lewis's relationship.
Sweet.
Yeah, that's great. We've got to get Patty on the show because her that book is phenomenal, and if listeners aren't familiar with it, definitely go check it out. I'll put another link. This is going to be a lot of links in the episode, but it'll be down there. Well, Crystal, it has been an absolute pleasure getting to know a little bit more about you and the work you're doing. I'm sure many of our listeners are very intrigued about your upcoming works and books, and then while they're waiting, obviously the work that you've already published, I'll have linked below, and they can check that out. But I think it's time for us to get into the chapter, right?
Let's dive in.
So we left off last time in chapter 15 with the Dawn Treader sailing through the Lassie, and we have now arrived here with chapter 16, which is entitled The Very End of the World. And Phil, it's an even chapter, so you have the final chapter summary for the voyage of the Dawn Treader.
All right, I'm ready. The Dawn Treader continues to glide east, effortlessly, through the Silver Sea. Once shallow water stops the ship's progress, Caspian announces his decision to journey on with Reepicheep to see the world's end. This causes an uproar, and an angry Caspian storms off to his cabin. When he emerges hours later, he reveals that Aslan gave him a talking to, and that Reep, Edmund, and Lucy will be the only ones to continue on. After the crew leaves, and Reepicheep leaves for Aslan's country, the children encounter Aslan himself, who tells them it is time to go home, but that he is in their world too, just by a different name. Edmund and Lucy find out they won't be able to come back. Caspian returns to Narnia and marries Ramadu's daughter, and the children return to our world, where everyone can't help but notice a permanent change in Eustace.
Very well done.
Fun fact about this summary, it took 194 words, and then it took another maybe 20 minutes to whittle it down, because I started writing, and then I realized just how much was in the chapter, and I had to delete most of what I wrote.
Did you get it below the 150 bar that we have?
149.
Very nice.
With a word to spare.
Well, what are some of y'all's initial reactions to this final chapter? We can start with you, Crystal.
Oh, wow. This is, again, I mentioned earlier, this is one of my favorite scenes in literature. If you think about, they've been on this massive ship, right, through this whole journey. One thing, David Downing has mentioned this before, but this particular book is very episodic. It's very much like the Odyssey, right, where all these people are on a ship and they're sort of, hopping to different places. And so now now to borrow from Homer, now Ithaca is in view. There's, we're at an end, and I love that this book ends with not on this massive ship, right, but on this little boat filled with an ocean filled with lilies, right? I love that scene, and I do believe that Reepicheep crossing over, there's not a lot of words given to it in the text other than sort of him on the crest of this wave, and then he vanishes, right? I love that image. And again, we're going to talk in a minute about Caspian's temper tantrum. That that is an interesting piece. But to me, Reepicheep's final journey is just one that this is, I don't mean this to sound mundane or whatever, but as a Christian, you believe that this is the prelude to what comes after. And there's a lot of trepidation about, death and crossing over and all this stuff. And I think it's just natural, that we are we're mortal creatures, and we can't guarantee what happens. We just have to have faith that we know what's next. And Reepicheep's, I guess, relinquishing of all that's behind him, like that just reckless abandon of floating into that new country, to me is just one of the most inspiring things. It's like, oh death, where is thy sting? Mm-hmm. That's what I love about it. It's like, I know where I'm headed, and I'm not scared, and I'm not frightened, and I'm not afraid, because I know that's where, it's where Aslan is, and that's where I'm headed. And his courage through that, and he even says multiple times, I'm not coming back.
Yeah.
This is it. I won't continue with you. But he's not. To me, he's so brave. He knows it, and he's okay with it. As a matter of fact, he almost seems like he's, looking forward to it. Into this new life, and so that's that image of Reepicheep on the crest of that wave, and then sort of dropping out of sight. Like, I love that scene so much. I think it's a good reminder that if we have faith, we're not scared to what happens next. We know what's next. And of course, also, I think one of my favorite scenes too is Aslan and the lamb, right? At the end, but that's coming up. But I love, like, I think Lewis ties it up so well. He does, and there is a lot in this chapter. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So much to tie up there, but he does it well. I think Lewis does it well.
Well, yeah, this is such a great way to end a book, and just the stuff you were saying about Reepicheep, just thinking about it, I got goosebumps again. And then a few seconds later, another round of goosebumps. Just the way Reep is quivering with excitement. Like mm-hmm. And he is letting go of his sword forever, which is just, like, you've seen almost every chapter how that sword comes into play. He's always ready to use his sword, and he's just giving it up, and he's excited about where he's headed. It's just so amazing.
One of my biggest takeaways was, and maybe y'all didn't feel this way, but I felt like this could have been the end of a trilogy. Like, this could have been the last of the would be the trilogy of the Narnian trilogy. And I was reading a little bit about when this was written. So it was written between January and February of 1950. And obviously we know it's published in 52, but it's written between January and February. And from what my research was telling me was that even by March, just a month after this is finished, Lewis actually begins work on The Horse and His Boy, which I thought was, if just having read this book, because it ends so smoothly, you have this. We now are four main characters that we began with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. All four of them are no longer coming back to Narnia. We don't know what happens to Eustace. Aslan tells them, you can find me back in your world by a different name, which we'll get to all that in a minute. But it felt very final. There was this sense of finality to it. And I was wondering, I was thinking maybe I was going to look at the timeline of writing these books, and there was going to be a large gap between the end of Dawn Treader and whatever book he wrote next, because it seemed like it was such a strong ending. And I was surprised to find out that no, Lewis, in just a month after this is done, begins another book. I mean, did y'all feel like there was a sense of finality here, that this really could have been the end of of Narnia?
Absolutely, yeah. And the way it does turn up, and the fact that Aslan says, you won't be coming back. It's almost like he's telling, he could be telling children, this is it. I've completed. But it's really interesting if you read those last 2 or 3 pages, is all of the imagery of commencement, of beginning. Right? They're sailing east. Right? East is where the sun rises. and the lamb says, "Come have breakfast."
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like all this imagery of and symbolism of this is a new day. This is a new beginning. So, yeah, I definitely feel like this could have easily been the end. I'm glad it wasn't. But, there is a sense of wrapping up, I guess, of tidying up there on the end. He could have ended it here. I'm glad he didn't. But I think we probably would have been satisfied with this ending.
I agree. I love how he left a little bit of room where he told the children, he told Edmund and Lucy specifically, "You're not coming back." But they asked about Eustace, and he goes, "Do you really need to know that?" And it just leaves that little bit of hope/doubt that maybe this isn't the end, and it really leaves room for other stuff.
So let's go ahead now and dive into our read through here. So the first thing that happens is we get more atmosphere building, as if we didn't have enough last chapter. And I promise you, I'm not complaining at all. We get a little bit of background of why Reepicheep jumped into the water when he saw the sea people. And Lewis talks more about this journey through the last sea. Then, as they're continuing to travel east and the sun's getting brighter and things are just getting more and more ethereal, there is something white on the horizon, right? And as the Dawn Treader gets closer and they turn south to see what it is, we find out it is Lilies. Phil, as a first-time reader, was this odd to you? Were you taken aback by seeing lilies in the middle of a sea?
I think if I had been just presented this chapter, I would not have expected this at all. But this just seems such a natural addition to the scenery that has already been described in the previous chapters. So we're moving further and further from the kind of world that we know, and he's still grounding it a little bit by describing them as lilies, even though, as Eustace points out, they're not actually lilies, but they're pretty close. It's the volume that I think is the most surprising, just how many there are, and how their entire surroundings is just like pure white, flowery atmosphere. It's great.
I really like the significance of it being lilies too. We think, so much of lilies we think of being on very still, calm water, right? And that's usually the exact opposite of a sea. And like you said, Phil, in the transition further and further east, this isn't surprising given what's happened over the last two chapters. But, if you were introduced to this at first, you'd be like, that's the exact opposite thing I'd want to see, that you'd think you'd see on a sea, are lilies, right?
Yeah.
And it's this beautiful thing of just serenity and calmness as the Dawn Treader goes further east. I mentioned this, I think, a chapter or two ago, that we've really passed any, except for what happens with Caspian's teenage temper tantrum in a minute, there's no really antagonism for the rest of the story. We don't, and even then Caspian's not about to fight anyone. It's really just becoming calmer and calmer and more serene as the crew of the Dawn Treader gets closer to Aslan's country.
Yeah. And that sereneness is why his temper tantrum stands out so much. And I think it may be even caused by he really wants to continue on this path, and probably going back to where Narnia is not exactly something that he wants to do.
Do you have any other thoughts about just this lead up to this exchange?
Well, to me, I think Caspian is so completely overwhelmed with what he sees, he doesn't want to leave. And I've heard people say, well, heaven is going to be so beautiful that this will be a shadow, like our former lives will be a shadow. And Lewis even says in a letter to, I think it's one of the letters to the American lady, Mary Shelbourne, I think, that it's like this whole part of our lives, once we die and we move on to heaven, like this whole part of our lives will be a whole dream, like a half waking dream or something to that effect. And that everything we've done to this point will just be a wash, right, into the glory that is ahead of us.
I like that. It's a really good point. And I've actually been, just as an aside, spending a little bit more time reading the letters of C.S. Lewis. I picked that up over a month or so ago, the one just called Letters of C.S. Lewis. And it has been fascinating to read just some of the things he wrote. And actually, later on, I want to pull a little bit from his letters to children when it comes to this conversation that they're going to have with Aslan, because it's so interesting to read him speaking. It just feels so vulnerable to read Lewis writing a letter. It's so personal, and I really enjoy that.
Yeah, I really did. One of my mentors was Bruce Edwards, the late Bruce Edwards.
Oh wow.
And he really was my mentor through so much of the beginning of my journey. So when he passed away suddenly, I literally explained it like, when you're reading Lord of the Rings and Gandalf, falls off the cliff.
Yeah.
And you're like, there's just this moment because you literally the paragraph ends and you flip the page and it's like, what now? That was kind of what I had felt. And he was telling me, I remember him telling me, if you really, really want to study Lewis, read the collected letters once every couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a beast to read.
He wrote a lot.
Oh my goodness, there's such it's over 5,000 pages, but
wow.
But it's a treasure trove. Yeah, it's a treasure trove. Yeah, I love them. They're some of my favorite things to read.
Well, let's go back now to this exchange here. So Caspian, like y'all mentioned, he's upset at what he's seeing because he knows that he can't stay. And what happens here is that he really does throw this temper tantrum, and it's really the most teenage that he has felt. I forget that as I read this book that he is young. One, because the movie kind of, he's like, I don't know, like 50 years old in the movie. He's not really, but he is very old in the movie. So he's an adult. And so sometimes I get that picture in my head, but he is a teenager here, but he's acted very mature throughout. Ever since all the stuff with Gumpus, he has acted more and more mature really as the book has gone on. And we saw that really be highlighted on Ramandu's Island as he goes through this whole ploy to get the men to continue on with him. That was a very mature thing he did and very wise. But here he reverts back to really some of the things that we saw from him in kind of his weaker moments back in Prince Caspian. And he's frustrated that he can't, continue on to Aslan's country, or just at least to the end of the world. And, the crew of the Dawn Treader are asking, is he abdicating the throne? Kind of what's happening here. And he gets pushback, obviously, from the crew, from Edmund, from Reepicheep, from Drinian. And he looks at them pretty sharply. And Lewis says he looks for a moment not unlike his uncle Miraz. And this is quite a big moment of tension in this final chapter. Tell me more. What do y'all think about this exchange between Caspian? Why is he doing this? And should we be frightened that he looks more like his uncle Miraz? Is this something larger, or is it just kind of a passing temptation?
When we think about Caspian as a developing leader, and again, like I've had to read a lot, with the leadership bent, for some of the work I've done. And, as a leader, he follows a pretty traditional path towards leadership. In Prince Caspian, he even says, he asks Aslan, do you think, I don't think I'm good enough, right? I don't think I'm ready to be a leader. And then Aslan sort of responds, because you question yourself, that shows me you are. That because you're humble and because you have doubts about yourself, like we all do, I think you'll make a great leader, right? And so from there, you're right. We see a pretty steady development of him, and because he's a good leader, he can yell out a lot of directives, and people do it, And to me, when I look at this in context to the Christian worldview, I sort of see Caspian sort of learning his place, right? He doesn't get to decide when he goes to Aslan's country. That's Aslan's decision, right?
Right.
So I think he throws a tantrum because, he's had, I guess, for lack of a better term, the cushion of leadership, that not that he hasn't earned it, but, he gets to the point where he makes a decision and he cannot implement that decision because it is not his decision to make. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why he gets frustrated, is because, he's like, well, I'm used to being, in charge. And then Aslan sort of gently reminds him, no, you're not in charge.
And this is it's such an interesting view of leadership too, where it goes both ways. Like, he is in charge of the people, but he also has a responsibility to the people. So he can tell them what to do, but they also in a way can tell him what he can and cannot do, which is really interesting considering he's the king and he's in charge of everybody.
And, I like that exchange because it does remind us that it's kind of a selfish decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're like, are you abdicating? What are we going to do? You're the leader. What, you're just going to leave? You're just going to abandon us all? Like, it sort of gives us a moment where we see, it's Caspian wanting to go further, but in the eyes of his people, it's a selfish choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it reveals quite a bit about his character because, again, it's not like he's going after a bad thing here. I mean, the end of the world is great, and it leads to Aslan's country, and so it's I think a lot about how Lewis talks a little bit. I think it's in Mere Christianity. He doesn't use this language, so I'm using different language than he does, but talks about kind of placing, good things over God himself, right? Placing things that God has created over the creator himself. And what Caspian's chasing after isn't this awful bad thing, right? Unlike his uncle Miraz, who does just desire power for the sake of power, Caspian isn't interested in that. He desires adventure and discovery, and even Aslan's country itself, and is frustrated because that isn't available to him right now, and he's putting that on a pedestal above, Aslan. And so I think that it's not this. It gives us this almost. It intrigues me to know more of what his kingly life will be like, because we know that he actually hasn't arrived at this perfect king yet. And yet over the last couple of chapters, he has appeared to be a really great king. And so it's a reminder that his story's not done. And there's more to his story as a king because he has not fully matured. And I think here he's only supposed to be about 16 years old. And so it's a great reminder that his story isn't over.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So he kind of storms off and he goes down into his cabin, and when he returns, he is pretty downcast, and we learn that he has to go back alone and at once. And we find out that he talked to Aslan in the cabin. He reminds us, no, Aslan couldn't fit in the cabin. Instead, it's that gold lion's head. I love how he has to remind us in case we were all thinking that, Aslan, who pretty much can transform into an albatross and do all these other incredible things that come back from the dead, like obviously he still couldn't fit in that cabin. So, just in case we were wondering that. And my question for y'all is, as we dive into, Aslan's appearance here, is Caspian being punished and having to go back, or was that always going to have to happen, and so he's just being reminded of his role?
I believe it was a reminder of his role. Absolutely. I think as we know now, he wasn't, like you said, the story wasn't finished literally and figuratively, because the silver chair is all about Caspian's descendants. And so if we look at it from that, I think it's really just it's almost like a father sort of sitting a son down and reasoning with him about it. Yeah. So I don't really think it's a punishment. I think it's a way to reason with him and to understand. Again, there's Lewis's reasoning. Lewis sort of explaining reasoning, which he does also. In Silver Chair, we see this sort of appeal to reason, an appeal to rationality. And so I think it's what he does with Caspian, is just sort of, father to son, sort of sits him down and explains that this is not his time. You're being a little dramatic, Caspian, and you need to accept your orders, right? You need to accept your role in this. It's not your time.
Right. And if he was being punished, he would be put in charge of duffel puds or something.
Yeah, those are some frustrating.
Yeah, Crystal, since we have you here, just as an aside, tell us what are your feelings on the duffel puds? They've been a controversial topic this season.
There were better invisible. No, the Dufflepuds kind of remind me of, like action with no thought. They're very much a slave to their instinct, and their impulses. Which makes them, I think, frustrating as characters. But I think for Lewis, it was a bit of comic relief. Because we do have a big ending here. Characters who are not returning, and one who literally slips over the edge of the world, and so I think he was trying to inject a little bit of comic relief. I'm sure as a kid I probably would have been like, oh, they're so funny, just like Jar Jar Binks, right?
I was literally saying Jar Jar Binks of the.
As a kid, you're like, oh, that's so funny, and then as an adult, you're like, oh my gosh, why did he show up again?
You're right.
They made him, they made him like, they put him in the Congress for Pete's sake,
Yeah, he gives Chancellor Palpatine power.
Yeah.
Although I will say, and I have become more. We haven't talked Star Wars at the end of the season. We've got to make sure we get a little bit of Star Wars.
Love Star Wars. Love
and
Star Wars.
I have become.
I'm so happy right now.
I have become kind of defensive about Jar Jar Binks because I was a little kid when Episode 1 came out. I was, I don't know, like 8 or 9, and he, I loved him at the time. And that was his purpose. And so I'm not a huge fan of him now, but I don't, I'm not someone who's like, oh, he ruined my childhood or something like that, because he was hilarious. He was my favorite, probably him and little Anakin Skywalker were my favorite characters in Phantom Menace because I was, Anakin's age. And so, it's funny. He's had a little bit, I feel like in the Star Wars community, there's been a resurgence of Ahmed Best, who played him. Because especially some of that motion capture stuff that he did was pretty ahead of its time. We think a lot about Andy Serkis and Gollum, which is incredible. But, Ahmed Best was doing something kind of similar a year or two earlier with Jar Jar Binks. So obviously he's not as remembered as fondly, unfortunately. But, but
well, even in the Silver Chair, right? At the end of the Silver Chair, they're talking about the overseer, or the house.
Yeah, exactly.
House lady, and they say, well, she was like any terrible leader, she was promoted, right? And at the end of that book, that's what Lewis says, and she was promoted. So I was just like, yeah, that's kind of how it works, doesn't it? No, Jar Jar's basically comic relief, I think, for kids. I think we as adults find him really frustrating. As an adult, I watched Star Wars. Mm-hmm. I watched Episode 1, because I was in college at the time, and I was just like, my gosh, that guy is just, why is he working around race pods? I mean, he's like the most clumsy creature ever. Like why like here's a dangerous sport. Let's put this really clumsy guy like in a dangerous sport. Let's see what happens, right? I guess it's the fictional, equation or whatever, but like but yeah, I mean, the Dufflepuds, I think, are just for little kids. That's a little nod to little kids, I think.
Yeah.
Just have something to giggle at, but
sure.
They are really frustrating. I remember on this reread, I was like, oh crap, I forgot about these guys.
Well, I'm glad to know that there's someone else who's not as big of a fan of them too, because I felt bad that I was giving them such a hard time, and so.
Oh, they're terrible. They're terrible.
Yeah.
They're just annoying.
You're the scholar, not me, so we have it on your authority that.
Well, that's still 2 cents. That's just,
I know.
my 2 cents, but
well,
they're just so combative, and they just argue with each other, and they remind me of like when you're just out in a crowd and people are just bickering, and like Black Friday or something. It's just there you go. It's just chaos. But anyway. So.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to some happier things. Actually, this is kind of sad though, is that we have the departing of our 4 people who are going into the world. So Eustace, Edmund, Lucy, and Reepicheep leave in this smaller boat, and they leave Caspian, and that's actually the end of Caspian in this story. And Lewis does not really go into depth here. He says he's not really going to talk about it. He says he won't dwell on it, and we move on. We say goodbye to Caspian for now, and then the 4 of them continue on into the Silver Sea. And Crystal, you were going to read something here from the text. Do you want to go ahead and do that?
Sure. This this is, I guess, right after Caspian exits, and the pilgrims, I guess, are continuing on. There's no need to row, for the current drifted them steadily to the east. None of them slept or ate. All that night and all next day, they glided eastward. And when the third day dawned, with a brightness you or I could not bear, even if we had dark glasses on, they saw a wonder ahead. It was as if a wall stood up between them and the sky, a greenish-gray, trembling, shimmering wall. Then up came the sun, and at its first rising they saw it through the wall, and it turned into wonderful rainbow colors. Then they knew that the wall was really a long, tall wave, a wave endlessly fixed in one place, as you may often see at the edge of a waterfall. It seemed to be about 30 feet high, and the current was gliding them swiftly toward it. You might have supposed they would have thought of their danger. They didn't. I don't think anyone could have in their position. For now they saw something not only behind the wave, but behind the sun. They could not have seen even the sun if their eyes had not been strengthened by the water of the last sea. But now they could look at the rising sun and see it clearly and see things beyond it. What they saw, eastward beyond the sun, was a range of mountains. It was so high that either they never saw the top of it or they forgot it. None of them remember seeing the sky in that direction. And the mountains must really have been outside the world, for any mountains even a quarter of the 20th of that height ought to have had ice or snow on them. But these were warm and green and full of forests and waterfalls, however high you looked. And suddenly there came a breeze from the east, tossing the top of the wave into foamy shapes and ruffling the smooth water all around them. It lasted only a second or so, but what it brought them in that second, none of those three children will ever forget. It brought both a smell and a sound, a musical sound. Edmund and Eustace would never talk about it afterwards. Lucy could only say, "It would break your heart." "Why," said I, "was it so sad?" "Sad? No," said Lucy.
Oof.
Wow, that is
So
a
good.
spectacular part of the book here.
I love that, just the conflict of emotions with it, right? What I should be sad, but I'm not, and I can't understand. Yeah, it's joy, you know. I love that part. It's beautiful, isn't it? I love Lewis's descriptions. The space trilogy also has some really great descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, and I just love that part. You know, it's just sort of to me it represents an ending and a beginning all at once.
Yeah.
And I get a feeling, and actually it's funny because here we are at the end of Dawn Treader, and this in some ways to me is reminiscent of the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where we have that feeling of Sehnsucht. And actually we had Brian Carnell on for that episode way back in season 1, who's is part of Narnia Web.
Mm-hmm.
And he had talked about that whole scene where, Lewis says I can't remember exactly what he's describing, but he's talking about Cara Paravel, and he's like, "Have you felt it? Or, do you remember this thing?" And we talked a lot about Sehnsucht, that feeling. And I, again, here at the end of this book, feel a similar feeling of Sehnsucht, because as they are, and I wonder if the Pevensies and Eustace and Reepicheep feel this as well, because they're looking out past, they see into these mountains, and you really can't help feeling that same feeling. I don't know if y'all feel that way, but I definitely do as we read this section.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think Caspian is jealous, right? I think
yeah.
of Reepicheep, right? And I think we all are after that description.
Mm-hmm.
It is sort of, again, it's an embracing of death, but not in a dark or a macabre way, It's the understanding that this was a prelude to something much, much more beautiful and much more glorious, right? So I love that. It's the end of the world, but it's not scary or intimidating, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it really just does remind me of that end of Wardrobe, and I was thinking about the even the connection between when Lewis is writing that we're looking out at the castle of Cair Paravel, looking east towards the sea, and he's talking about that cry of the seagulls and have you heard it and can you remember it? It almost was like foreshadowing a little bit of what is to come with Aslan's country to the east. It's really just a beautiful feeling that you get as a reader.
And I can imagine being a child, right, and reading this and being comforted about what death is. And as a kid, my parents took me to a whole lot of funerals.
Oh, man.
And not on purpose. I mean,
they were like, what are we doing on?
They just do a lot of old people. I guess I don't know, but like I remember at one point, like I drew a cemetery. Right, my mom was like, you know what, we just need to leave Crystal at home. Get a babysitter. But it was interesting because as a young, and that's just in the South. That's part of paying respects to someone is to attend the memorial. But as a kid, I think I had the same curiosities about death and all those unanswered questions that most kids do. And if I had read this as a child, it would make death seem not so scary and uncertain. It's a homecoming more.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is such a powerful counter to the sadness that one could feel. I just love it brought both a smell and a sound, a musical sound, and how it breaks. It would break your heart, but it wasn't sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's keep going further into this, because as they're here in the Silver Sea, looking out past this wave, it's now time for Reepicheep to leave. So I'm going to go ahead and read a section from the chapter right now. So Lewis is writing this as Reepicheep has now decided it's time for him to get into his little coracle and head off on his own. They did not even try to stop him, for everything now felt as if it had been fated or had happened before. They helped him to lower his little coracle. Then he took off his sword. "I shall need it no more," he said, and flung it far away across the lilied sea. Where it fell, it stood upright with the hilt above the surface. Then he bade them goodbye, trying to be sad for their sakes, but he was quivering with happiness. Lucy, for the first and last time, did what she had always wanted to do, taking him in her arms and caressing him. Then hastily he got into his coracle and took his paddle, and the current caught it, and away he went, very black against the lilies. But no lilies grew on the wave. It was a smooth green slope. The coracle went more and more quickly, and beautifully it rushed up the wave's side. For one split second, they saw its shape and Reepicheep's on the very top. Then it vanished, and since that moment, no one can truly claim to have seen Reepicheep the mouse. But my belief is that he came safe to Aslan's country and is alive there to this day. And that's the end of Reepicheep's life here in Narnia. That's really, I mean, what do you make of all that, Crystal?
It's beautiful, right? It's beautiful. It makes, I think a lot of Dylan Thomas's "Do not go gently into that good night," right? About like when it comes your time, go boldly, go knowing that you lived a good life. This is how I think a lot of us want to exit, to put your sword down, right? It's symbolic, right? Of, I've run my race, right? To put your sword down and pick up your oar. And honestly, on a literary level, this is one thing I love about Lewis, and having studied creative writing, on the fictional side of it, like Lewis is such a fantastic writer. He's so fantastic. His nonfiction is what got me, but his fiction kept me. And I love this scene. It's, like I said, it's just one of my favorites in literature, period. Is this sort of giving up the ghost, right? Giving up the sword, and picking up the oar, and going into the great unknown not with trepidation or fear, but with excitement and wonder.
Did y'all make any connections between this, the sword being flung away and landing upright in the sea with King Arthur? I was thinking about what is it? Is it Thomas Mallory's version? I think where I know there's a bunch of different versions of King Arthur, but where Arthur gets the sword from the Lady of the Lake, and it's there kind of sticking out of the water in this way. And obviously Lewis would have been very familiar with his medieval literature. And so I was making a connection just as this kind of shout out that he's not actually the king, but this kind of perfect knight we see in Reepicheep. Did y'all make any of those connections?
Yeah, I definitely thought it was. And I I was doing some research actually just recently through the letters where he mentioned reading Le Mort d'Arthur or whatever, like the death of Arthur, as when he was I can't remember if it was when he was studying with Kirkpatrick or when he was early in his Oxford days. I think it was during Kirkpatrick's his stint with Kirkpatrick. But
yeah,
obviously I think a lot of Lewis's work is imbued with literary allusions to other great works. Yeah, I definitely felt that way.
Yeah. Well, Phil and Crystal, any more thoughts before we move into this final scene in the book?
No, I'm ready to talk about this.
All right. So then finally, with just the three humans left, they head to a small little, I guess, sandy island that then turns into green grass. And then here we are led to the very final scene in the book. And here they come across a lamb who is cooking some fish. And the lamb asked them to come and have breakfast. Phil, do you want to take it from here? What happens next?
Yeah, so Lucy immediately has a question, and she says, "Please, lamb, is this the way to Aslan's country?" And the lamb says that door to Aslan's country is actually in their own world. And soon after, the lamb transforms into Aslan himself in his lion form.
And this is interesting here. Obviously, so many things are happening through allegory and through just imagery here. We obviously have Aslan as a lamb, which is a very clear kind of Christian symbol, the lion and the lamb. But I actually want to just talk really quickly about something that I had never thought of as a reader of this book, and that is John, the Gospel of John, chapter 21. So as I was, I try to do a little bit of research for each chapter, and as I was doing that, Karkanen, Hinton, and Brown, who are three people we've looked at regularly throughout this book, they all made connections to the 21st chapter of John. And Lewis himself, as I was doing some more reading of his letters, actually talks about this. And I want to read from Lewis's one of his letters to children. Here's what he says. Listen to this. At the very edge of the Narnian world, Aslan begins to appear more like Christ as he is known in this world. Hence the lamb, hence the breakfast, like at the end of St. John's Gospel. Does not he say, "You have been allowed to know me in this world," meaning Narnia, "so that you may know me better when you get back to your own"? And so I had to go back and I was reading chapter 21 of John, and I always think about this as that time when Jesus, and this is after, for people who aren't familiar, this is after Jesus's resurrection. He's eating breakfast with some of the disciples, and I always thought of this as, this is when Jesus tells Peter to, tend my sheep after having denied Jesus 3 times. He then is kind of, gets this question again 3 times. But it goes on, and as they're having this discussion, Peter turns and asks Jesus about John. So Peter Jesus tells him kind of how he's going to die. And then he turns and he says this. This is from chapter 20, verse 20. Let me read this. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. And if you're not familiar, that is John writing about himself. The one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." And
Whoa.
so, and this is, and so this is actually exactly what Paul Karkanen wrote here. He wrote just these 2 sentences in response to this. After Jesus tells Peter he will die a violent death, Peter is worried that John may be left on earth till Christ's return. Jesus tells him not to worry about John. In like fashion, Aslan tells Edmund and Lucy they will not return to Narnia. When they ask whether Eustace will return, Aslan questions their need to know the answer. And I had never made this connection before, and I thought that was a really interesting thing. And this is something that it isn't just a guess. Lewis himself talks about this being an allusion in one of his letters, or an allusion to the Gospel of St. John.
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of hard to
really,
unsee.
Really great.
Yeah.
That's really great. So even in like The Horse and His Boy, right? Aslan tells the characters, you will only know your story. You will not know the story of others. You will only know your story. And there's so many. You know, one of the things I noticed when I was reading Lewis's letters is there's so many biblical quotations and allusions to Scripture. I mean, even when he was a teenager, you know, he was writing to his father who had been sick, and he said, you know, when you feel better, write to me about what the locusts have taken, or something like that, which is a quote from Joel, you know, and he's like 16 at the time. You know, it's pretty amazing, and the way that he, I guess, appropriates biblical truths to make them I guess, digestible for children is just so fascinating to me. I think he just does a magnificent job of that.
He really does.
Absolutely.
I've found that my understanding of stuff in the Bible has improved since we started doing this podcast, just because of being forced to slowly read chapter by chapter and kind of analyze it a little closer than I did the first round.
I think that's the mark of a great book, right? Is that there's layers and you peel those layers away. And, you know, Lewis even talked about that. Like his joy of rereading was that he found something different each time he read. And, you know, ironically, but not surprisingly, his own works have that same quality.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit more about this conversation that they have, because there's so many great, you know, quotes here in all of Narnia. Like, some of the best stuff comes from this scene. So I just want to kind of just go around and ask, like, what was something that's, because, you know, we could just sit here and read the entire thing before we get calls from the C.S. Lewis estate. So we won't do that. But I mean, some of the just things we hear is, you know, Aslan says, I have another name in your world. You need to learn to know me by that name. He also calls himself the great bridge builder, and says, you know, I shall be telling you all the time. When Lucy says, will you tell us how to get into your country from our world? There's so many different things happening here. So let's just, you know, what's one of the ones that stands out to y'all?
I think the bridge builder one is nice. Again, just from a reader's perspective as an adult, right? This book is a bridge between children's and more mature spiritual literature. So it's it is like we just mentioned. It's almost like overt, right? Biblical scriptural references in this section, because it is sort of answering those questions for kids. You know, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to Reepicheep? What's going to happen to these characters? So I think, like, the bridge builder thing to me, and it's capitalized in my version. I don't know if it is in yours, but you know, as it's an actual it's an actual title, right? That Aslan is building that bridge between their world and ours, right? Between a more childish approach to literature to a more mature, spiritually mature and adept approach to literature. It's a really neat way to describe on multiple levels what Lewis is doing here.
Yeah. For me, it's a very small little detail, but right before they find themselves back in Aunt Alberta's home, they have the feel of Aslan's mane and a lion's kiss on their foreheads. And what stands out to me about that is a lion is a very powerful, dangerous, and as we found out from Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, he's not safe, but he's good. And just the lion kind of, there's so much power there, and then he's kissing them on their forehead. I just think that's such a great connection to God, who's this all-powerful being, but he loves us. And just how exciting and scary and terrifying that must be to be next to a lion, especially one like Aslan, who is this kind of Christ figure. And it's just such a great, very last thing to happen before they're back in their own world.
That exchange also reminds me back to, it's chapter 15 of Wardrobe, where Lucy and Susan are, Aslan has been resurrected, and I think Lewis writes that it's clear as they have like a little romp together, and Lewis says it's unclear whether it was more like, I think, playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, and Lucy can't make up her mind. And so it's kind of that same feeling with Aslan, this great animal, but also this very gentle, mane and this lion's kiss.
Yeah.
Like that blend of fear and admiration. Really
Absolutely.
is so like I think all of his descriptions of Aslan are like that. You know, they talked about, I think that was in Line, Witch, and Wardrobe, where they talk about the velvet paws, right? The things with it has a claws, right? They have claws, but they're also velvet. So it's this dual, you know, this dichotomy of being scary and being reassuring. Yeah, I love Aslan. I just, I mean, just such a fantastic character from start to finish. But yeah, he's so great in this one, and I love how he never can give a straight answer when it comes to things that are in the future. If we're talking about things in the future or something that concerns someone else, he's like, well, that's not your business.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so yeah, I love the way he keeps it personal.
But he doesn't even tell him no. He says, "Do you really need to know that?" And you're just, you can't. How do you answer that? Because no, you don't need to know that.
It's just it's a Socratic answer.
Yeah.
Right. He answers with another question and ends the conversation. It's just so well done.
And that is very Christ-like of him, I feel like.
I agree.
To not give a straight answer. And yeah. And I think my favorite thing here is just his answer. If you have to know me by another name, I feel like it's cliche to say that, but it's cliche for a good reason. That, you know, he tells the children that they have to know him by another name, and that was the very reason that they were brought to Narnia, was that by knowing him, you know, in Narnia for a little bit, they may know him better back in our world. And it's really a beautiful thing, and probably the most allegorical that the book has gotten when it comes to Aslan and Christ, because Aslan has really played more of he's been behind the scenes for the most part. He doesn't show up a lot in this book, and when he does show up, it's maybe, you know, just like the Caspian scene that happened earlier, which is we actually don't see it, we just hear about it, or you know, it might be kind of through the albatross that Lucy sees. Except, so I mean, I can't think of a time in the book except for the conversation with Eustace, where Aslan really shows up in kind of a similar way that he's done with, you know, in Prince Caspian or in Narnia. And in some ways, this book is kind of like the Esther of the Chronicles of Narnia, in that, you know, Aslan plays a large role still. He's obviously so much a part of this story through much of the divine providence that occurs, but he's not at the forefront as a character like he is in both Caspian and Wardrobe so far.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. In the letters to children, you know, there was a mother that wrote to Lewis, and there was a letter that he had received where the child was more in love with Aslan than with Christ, or they were concerned that the child was going to be more in love with the character, right, than with Jesus. And so Lewis kind of instructs them to say, well, you know, my hope is that they develop a love of Christ through Aslan, right? Like he's a bridge, right? He's a conduit to a greater sort of spiritual understanding. You know, and Lewis, like he said in a letter to a friend of his, that he didn't really see himself more as a theologian, but more as, I think, an interpreter, and, you know, like someone who was just making things more accessible. He just thought that was his job, was to make these mysterious things more accessible to people.
That's such a great pull too, because I actually I have that letter in front of me. I want to read a little bit what Lewis says, because that response to that little boy is phenomenal. And his name's Lawrence. And here's what Lewis writes. He says, Lawrence can't really, and he's italicized, really love Aslan more than Jesus, even if he feels that's what he's doing. For the things he loves in Aslan for doing or saying are simply the things Jesus really did and said. So that when Lawrence thinks he is loving Aslan, he is really loving Jesus, and perhaps loving him more than he ever did before.
I love that.
That's really great. Yeah, I really enjoy. I can't recommend to our listeners more that reading Lewis's letters are phenomenal, especially the ones to children. I love seeing that side of Lewis, and it feels more like we're getting more of kind of Lewis as narrator of Narnia, that same version of him, just in actuality, right?
And it was unfiltered Lewis. But it's just as good, or I think in many cases better.
Yeah.
You know, just because it is off the cuff, sort of extemporaneous responses to people who are asking questions. And he talks, I remember I was talking with someone a few years ago, and they said, well, didn't Lewis say he didn't really like writing all those letters? And he did. There were a couple of, I think there's one metaphor where he says it's that writing his pen was like an oar to a galley slave or something. It was, because he was
pretty intense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was doing, like 2-3 hours a day, some days, of just responding to people's letters, which I'm sure was laborious and, to somebody who's still working, a job and trying to do writing on the side. But still, he felt it was his duty, his Christian duty, to respond to people. And because of that, we have this absolute treasure trove of reflections and responses from him, because people, kept those letters. And there's still actually some that are surfacing even now, that people have found, tucked away in different places. And so it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And I feel like when I read those letters, he's speaking to this generation. He's speaking to us still about the things that we struggle with.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Well, before the story ends, there's just 2 things that Lewis needs to let us know. And that the first one is that Caspian and his men make it back to Ramandu's island. Caspian then marries Ramandu's daughter, and they go back to Narnia, and he reigns as king and she reigns as queen. And then we get a great bookend, because the story begins with Eustace and how awful of a child he is, and it ends with Alberta being very disappointed with him because he's become so commonplace and tiresome. But everyone else around Eustace has thought that he has really improved as a little boy. And then that's how the story ends.
That is a nice bookend, isn't it?
It is. Mm-hmm. It is. It's a nice cyclical tie up there. And I love it. And I mean, like, his transformation through this book is phenomenal. And again, what I love about Lewis's characters are they're still flawed, even if they go through the change. I mean, if you read Silver Chair, there are still some character flaws that Eustace has to deal with, right? Just like with Caspian, right? He's been this great leader, but then he hits this snag when he can't go into Aslan's country. They're still very human in the way that they handle a crisis. But Eustace, I think, is one of the biggest changes throughout the whole series, I think.
All right, y'all. Well, any final thoughts on this chapter or this book before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I'm very excited for what's next. I think that this was a great. The first 3 books in doing this project has been so fun, and I'm really excited because I feel like Lewis has demonstrated that he's not going to write the same thing 7 times. It's going to be very different, but still good, and I'm really excited to reread the Silver Chair.
I love it. I love these stories. Like, it's just like going back in time. Like, I get lost in them, and that's what I love about it. I was teaching school, and you've probably seen some of this too, but you hear about the books that the kids like to read, and they go into these specific genres, and the genres have a lot of the same tropes in them, right? There's different YA, I guess, tropes or whatever. And what I loved about Narnia is that it's not the same story, right? I mean, even with things like, for example, like some of my kids have read Harry Potter, and it's like if you've read the books, it's kind of like the same thing over and over again. I mean, forgive me, but like, it's like, oh, here's this guy, he's pretending to be something else. Whoop. It's almost like a Scooby-Doo ending, right? Like, here's another, oh, he was pretending to be blah, 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 and, putting out this, trying to get this, not that, those are bad stories or anything, but, I think that a lot of times some of Southern children's lit tends to be repetitive. And Lewis did not do that at all. He created 7 very, very different and very complex worlds. I mean, The Last Battle to me is just one of the most complex children's books I've ever read, because he's dealing with some very heavy situations, in that book. Much different than the nice, tidy ending we get here, in Dawn Treader. There's a lot more, I guess, darkness, in The Last Battle. But I love this story. I love this story so much. I mean, I do. And I love this ending.
Yeah, it really is great. I think so far this is probably my favorite ending of all the books we've done on the show. And Phil, I want to know, I think I did this last season too. Of the 3 books we've read so far, can you rank them for listeners? Just since you've only read these 3 as an adult.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, I think my order may have changed since last time, but this one is my favorite right now. And followed by Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then Caspian.
Okay, cool. I think we'll always end each season kind of seeing where your update is as you read each book as an adult.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to know as you go through how that list changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious to see how that turns out too. But just this book has done so many different things, and like you said, it's not relying on tropes or anything. It's so different, but it's also done so well. And I feel like the last 3 or 4 chapters, I was just completely immersed in the story and the scenery, and even it's pretty incredible I've read it, I read each chapter twice, but then to hear someone read it out loud and to find myself getting lost in it again. And it's supposed to be in podcasting mode, but I'm just sitting back and enjoying hearing the story again. So I think that has really bumped it up in my list.
And I can't stress this enough. Just you made me think of this, Phil, by saying that if any listeners are, wanting to engage more with Narnia while we're between seasons, if you haven't already, speaking of listening to it, I would highly recommend checking out the audiobook version of Dawn Treader. I think Jacoby is the guy who does this book, and I've talked about it a lot this season. It is absolutely phenomenal. He does such a great job. So for listeners, if you haven't listened to that yet, you want a little bit more Narnia while you're waiting for the silver chair, go ahead and go listen to that. You can probably find on Audible or I don't know where else you listen to audio, but that's where I listen to my audiobooks. So, but it really is great. It's so great to hear him. He does so many good voices, and just to hear the story be presented audibly as opposed to reading it, it's brand new. It feels fresh. Well, y'all, before we leave, we do have some listener feedback to get to. I have picked out just a short email here because I know we're already running a little long. So this is an email from Madeline, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's entitled Into the Lantern Waste. Hi, Daniel and Phil. I recently started listening to season 1 of your podcast at the recommendation of my younger brother who loves the Chronicles of Narnia possibly more than I do. I've been greatly enjoying listening to your commentary on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the insights that you have regarding it. I'm excited to continue listening, especially as you get into some of my favorite books in the series, namely The Silver Chair, The Magician's Nephew, and The Last Battle. I wanted to email you because I recently heard an album of songs based entirely on the Chronicles of Narnia and loved it when I listened to it. I don't think there has been a single day since I heard it that I haven't listened to at least some of the songs because it's just so good. The album is by Sarah Sparks, and it is called Into the Lantern Waste. The songs are mostly from the perspective of characters in the series and weave in truths from the Bible and parallel stories in the Bible. I have found it to be a wonderful insight and a deeper connection of the series to the Bible. I highly recommend you listen to it and let me know your thoughts on it. I'm including a link here to the album on YouTube. And so I will put that also in the episode's description. Again, this episode's description is getting very, very long. It'll keep listeners busy while we're gone. She then finishes and says, "Thank you for starting this podcast and for sharing it with us. It has been such fun to listen along. Blessing, Madeline."
Oh, that was great.
And so and I will tell listeners, definitely check out the album. I've been listening to it. It's on Spotify as well, too. It's really interesting. I didn't know that this existed, a whole album of songs based on Narnia. Were you aware of this, Crystal, at all? Have you heard of this?
I have not heard of that. I know that Red, the band Red, did something with Till We Have Faces a few years ago.
Oh, cool.
And there was, I love Red. But I know that's like 2005 rock scene, but
go for it.
Again, I'm showing my age. No, but there's been some really cool stuff. Somebody sent me something a while back, but it was a band, but it wasn't that. This is something brand new. I've not heard of that, so I'll check it out.
Yeah, it's really neat. I would highly recommend checking it out. It's really when we got this email, I just started searching. I even outside of Sarah Sparks here, I just started searching different songs written about Narnia on Spotify, and it has been very fun to kind of just find all these different, a lot of musicians or bands I've never heard of, who I'm like, oh wow, they wrote this song based on a scene in The Magician's Nephew. How cool is that? And so yeah, I would, I would just recommend that listeners go and just start searching, because I didn't realize how much existed out there. And that's been one of the best parts of this podcast as we wrap up our third season here, is just, I think, Phil, you and I started this thinking that this was, this was a smaller community that we didn't know much about. And we have sometimes talked about Narnia feeling a little bit like an underdog series in a way. But it's so cool. The more we do this podcast, I'm realizing how large this community is, how and just how many people truly love these stories. And it's been wonderful to be able to hear from listeners and get to talk to people like you, Crystal. And it's really and truly, I'm so thankful for all that Narnia has provided us.
Me too.
Yeah, I'm very, like I said, I love this. Thank you guys so much for this podcast and for allowing people to do a deep dive into these books, because they're so worth it. And I love the fact that like people are making music and writing books out of, Lewis and Tolkien and all the Inklings works, because that's what they did, right? They had these beloved books and works of art, and they created out of that. And now, the legacy continues with people making art and doing work around their pieces of work. So it's really fascinating, and it's cool, and I'm firmly believe in Tolkien's idea of subcreating, that God is the artist, right? And we are all sort of borrowing ideas from him and, making something new. And that is another reason I love Lewis, is because he always gave the glory to God. He never took any of the fame stuff. I mean, he hated being famous. He hated it. I mean, he hated being on Time magazine's cover. He hated it, and didn't like it. People would write him and say, oh, I saw you on Time magazine. He was like, yeah. He was very, very dismissive of it. But he wanted to be used by God, and God used him. So
absolutely.
And we're all grateful for that,
Sure.
for that obedience.
Yeah. Well, Crystal, thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been an absolute pleasure. It's been really great to end our season here with you and all of your wisdom and insight and knowledge. And so just thank you for sharing that with us and with our listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been quarantined for like a month, and I haven't got to talk to anybody about anything unless it, involves schoolwork or something. So like when somebody's like, hey, tell me about C.S. Lewis, I'm like, how long do you have? Grab a stickers.
Yeah, no, thank you for being on. So before we go ahead and end this episode, just as a reminder to listeners, we will be back with the Silver Chair on July 29th. And then we do have a couple of hiatus episodes planned between that. So they'll always be released on Wednesday. So just check your podcast feed to see when those are up. Like I said, we'll release a couple between then, and then we'll be back with Chapter 1 of the Silver Chair on July 29th.
I'll wrap us up here. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you too can listen to a bonus episode each month, along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, Madeline Heising, Hannah Anderson, John Marr, and Emily Margaret for supporting us at the Care Paravel level. Follow us into Narnia on our Twitter or Facebook pages, and you can leave any feedback at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. I'd also appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts. This helps everyone else find the show and join our read-through. And also make sure you subscribe to the show so you can wake up every other Wednesday to a new episode starting in July. Thanks for coming along on this journey, and we'll be back next time with The Silver Chair.